Gun control has not resulted in a reduction of firearms homicide or overall suicide in Canada. In 2012, I published a definitive study on firearms laws in Canada and homicide. It showed no associated benefit from background checks, authorizations to transport, and gun registries on firearms homicide and spousal homicide. At the time, some people were shocked with such findings, but the reality is these findings did not disagree with most of the published work already out there. And I've brought some of that with me here for you guys to submit into records. Let's briefly review some of these other studies and how they agree with my work. First, let's consider the recent meta-review that most of the organizations here are referring to, called What Do We Know About the Association Between Firearms Legislation? I will quote directly from this paper. Cross-sectional studies addressing the associated between background checks, waiting periods, and firearms deaths produce mixed results. A great number of papers found no association between background checks and firearm homicides, as follows: Kleck and Patterson, Sumner et al. 2008, Lawton Mustard 1997, McDowell et al. 1995, Ludwig and Cook 2000, Hahn et al. 2003, and Wintemute in 2018. My paper also showed that laws targeting restricted firearms such as handguns and certain semi-automatic and full automatic firearms in Canada in the 80s, 90s, and 2000s had no associated effect. From the same 2016 review, Coper and Roth, 2001, Gies, 2014, also found the assault weapons ban in the United States had no associated benefit. A paper recently published by Montreal professors Blaise and Gagné in 2011, while only looking at the early stages of gun licensing, also agreed with my assessment and said that homicides committed by restricted and prohibited firearms were not affected by the introduction of these laws. Now let's look at this review and what it said about Canada. Laniers and Lester, 1999, Mauser and Holmes, 1992, McPhadren and Mauser, 2013, are all in agreement with my study. Australia has long been cited as a model for gun control. It is a country of controlled borders and universal background checks and cross-country firearms laws. Interestingly, the published research from Australia also agrees with my study. Firearms legislation is not associated with a decrease in firearms homicide. One of the most recent and commonly cited Australian papers, Chapman et al. 2016, demonstrates no statistically significant benefit between the Australian firearms legislation and firearms homicide. Lee and Saudi, 2008, Baker and McPhadren, 2007, and most recently in October, Gilmore et al. In 2018 demonstrate the same results. Let's turn to suicide and firearms. Suicide by firearms in Canada has been on a steady decline since the 1980s. Suicide by other methods has been on a slow, steady increase. Recent analysis was performed by myself on this data and demonstrates no statistically significant change in the decline post-legislation in the 1990s. There was a small drop in firearms suicide that corresponds with a similar increase in non-firearms suicide. I use another method called difference and differences to analyze this, and the same thing was found. We are now seeing a slow, steady increase in firearms licenses held by the population. If these were increasing, we would see firearms suicide rates should also increase. Regression analysis performed on this data also shows that there was no association. Finally, if some provinces had more licensed firearms owners, that province should have a higher rate of suicide. However, same thing. Analysis on firearms owners across the provinces show that provinces with a higher rate of firearms licensing has no higher rate of firearms suicide. A notable association was found with the number of natives on reservations, suggesting a problem lies there. How does this compare with the published literature? There's some evidence that an increase in firearms laws also is associated with a decrease in suicide by firearm. This is not always the case. For instance, a paper by Hemingway, 2013, demonstrate no association between firearms legislation and ownership rates and firearms suicide. The question is whether people substitute another method for suicide, such as hanging, thus result in no overall increase in rates. Hanging, according to some studies, is successful a method as firearms. Caron, 2004, looked at Canadian Native reservations and firearms laws in the 1990s and found no overall significant change in firearms suicide, as a drop in suicide by firearm was accompanied by an increase in suicide by hanging. Chung and Dua, 2005, in young men, showed that in the 1990s, Suicide rates by firearms dropped by 40%, but was associated with an increase in 40% of hanging. Cleve et al. 2009 examined Australia, and a similar substitution phenomenon was found. Most recently, Gilmore et al. In 2018 showed no association between suicide and legislation. Methods that have been shown to be more effective in reducing firearms homicides involves targeting the demand side of firearms prevalence in criminal activity. As demonstrated by StatsCan, a significant percentage of firearms homicide involves gangs, and a recent fluctuation in these rates largely involves Toronto, Ontario. As youth violence increased in Boston in 1995, they launched Operation Ceasefire, which involved reducing the demand for weapons by targeting gangs specifically in terms of warnings and legal interventions, as well as working with the community groups and workers to reduce youth membership in gangs. The other arm of Operation Ceasefire involved reducing the supply of weapons by legal interventions and to decrease weapons trafficking and availability. Braga et al. 2001 examined both aspects of Operation Ceasefire, found the demand side was effective, but the supply side, and that is targeting weapons trafficking, was ineffective. To reduce violence,
I ask you to wrap it,
yeah.
please.
To reduce violence that is currently occurring in Canada, the evidence suggests you need to reduce youth involvement in gangs and gang activity, not just by legal interventions, but also deterring youth from entering gangs at the pre-contemplation stage. A research report by Public Safety Canada gathered evidence from another number of programs operating in Canada to reduce gang participation and demonstrated beneficial effects in the ranges of 50% in terms of gang participation.
Professor Mauser?
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. Before I start, I would like to apologize. First of all, I'm as deaf as a post. This is bilingue. It works in French or does not work as well as in English. Second, I'm hopeful that the charts that I had asked to be distributed will be distributed, so I apologize for them not yet being in your hands. I'm Gary Mauser, Professor Emeritus at Simon Fraser University. As part of my academic duties, I have published in criminology and political science for over 30 years. It is my professional opinion that Bill C-71 is a Rube Goldberg contraption that assumes, without evidence, that multiplying regulations will reduce criminal violence. The government offers concerns, but produces no hard evidence. Bill C-71 myopically focuses on gun crime, and a gun is used in less than 1% of violent crimes. The problem is criminal violence, not guns. Knives are used in as many murders as are firearms. You should have one of these in your hands. Worse, confusing licensed firearms owners, holders of possession acquisition licenses, with criminals, Bill C-71 misses the target completely. At least 1 million Canadians own guns without recourse to anything legal. These are the people that you should control. I ask the Senate to exercise sober second thought. Bill C-71 will not improve public safety. It is not a small step. It is, in fact, an endangerment to public safety because it misdirects scarce public resources. How big a threat is a licensed firearms owner? Moose in Canada kill more people each year than registered licensed firearms owners. He is unregistered, unlicensed. Criminal violence is gangs. It has increased since the magic number Minister Goodale picked, 2013, while PAL holders have not increased their violence. At least 10 times as many people die each year from medical mistakes in our hospitals than PAL holders are accused of killing. The worst mass murder in Canada did not involve a firearm. Gasoline. Suicide. Even where guns are prolific, readily available, hanging is the preferred method of committing suicide. Here is a chart for the nation. As you can see, if you had one, the hanging frequency increases and the shooting frequency decreases. Hanging is your problem. Most suicidologists will tell you the problem is mental health and suicide, not access to guns. Healthy people are not suicidal. This room is not likely to commit suicide with anything. Bill C-71 also neglects the overwhelmingly positive contribution PAL holders make to Canada. If you assess cars, cell phones, sex, marriage, haircuts by only the negative consequences, you would think they were all dangerous and inimical. It is irrational to merely look at the downside of anything. No evidence has been produced that PAL holders are a major source of crime guns. No evidence has been produced that there are significant abuses of the authorization to transport restricted firearms. On average, the number of PAL holders accused of homicide are so small that Statistics Canada is concerned about their reliability. Over the past 20 years, between 13 and 20 PAL holders have been suspected or accused of homicide annually, out of 2 million people. Obviously, not all suspects are accused, nor are all accused convicted. As Senator Pratt has demonstrated, the lion's share of firearms homicide is committed by illegal gun owners. No methodologically valid study has been able to find evidence that stricter gun laws or even gun bans have reduced general homicide rates or spousal homicide rates, as my two colleagues have already stated. A simple example. In 1995, the Canadian government banned over 1/2 of all legally registered handguns. Banned, over 1/2. Not only have handguns remained the murder weapon of choice, but gang killings have increased. Gun bans, by the evidence, do not seem very useful. For over 30 years, legal gun ownership in Canada has increased, but homicide rates have decreased. Bill C-71 falsely assumes criminals get their guns from lawful domestic sources. The government claims the source of crime guns has changed. This is false. The only thing that has changed is the definition of crime guns. At the height of the long gun registry, StatsCan data showed that only 4% of guns used in homicide could have been stolen or used in gathered in a straw purchase. Fourth, the government cannot provide solid evidence to support concerns about the problems with ATTs, or authorizations to transport restricted weapons. An access to information request found out that over 1 million ATTs were issued and 0.5%, less than 0.5%, were any kind of abuses. For this, you need legislation, perhaps better management. Requiring additional ATTs divert scarce political resources. Internal audits show that there are serious backlogs in data processing for the police. This backlog denies judges and CFOs timely access to vital information. By increasing the paper burden, C-71 will endanger public safety. This is not a small step in the right direction. This is a big step backwards. To sum up,
Ask you to sum up. Thank you.
thank you. To sum up, Bill C-71 is fundamentally misguided. Gun owners are a public safety resource, not a threat. Bureaucratic busywork diverts scarce police resources away from programs that are more effective in dealing with violent criminals. Inflating the already bulging federal firearms bureaucracy will not solve the real problems facing our youth in gang-infested corners of Canada or women in abusive relationships. I respectfully ask the Senate to reject Bill C-71, exercising the sober second thought for which you were well regarded. Thank you.
Thank you.